All right, we're good to go when you are, right, Dylan?
Okay,
Alright,
cool.
sweet.
Am I in frame? I'm all good?
Yep.
All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode, the last episode, at least with me, of the PolitiTeen's podcast. So, for one last time, I'm your host, Ray Hennessy, and today I'm joined with our producer, Max Kalman. How are you?
Hey, Ray, thanks for having me on. That was a lot sadder than I thought it was going to be.
Yeah, I don't know. I just felt like I had to frame it right for the context of this episode, because mostly, not mostly, we don't really know exactly how this conversation will play out, but a lot of it's going to be like a kind of a year in review, how the podcast went, things, how they basically why they happened the way they happened, and so on and so forth. But first, it is Easter. You have any Easter plans?
I don't. I have some plans related to the other holiday that's taking place this year, but no Easter plans directly. I think you're religious, right? You mentioned that you're going to church today, or?
I'm not like religious. It's one of those things I feel like I should always be like working on. I know like Miles said it was like Catholic guilt. It's like partially true.
Oh, you're Catholic family?
Yeah, like my family isn't like really hard Catholic. Like even my dad, he's like kind of Baptist, I'm not gonna lie, but my grandma goes to Catholic church and we go to church with my grandma. So I've spent my entire life, when I do go to church, I go to Catholic church. And for Easter, I know my dad wanted me to be home for the weekend and kind of spend time with the family for Easter and all that stuff. So I felt kind of bad. So I feel compelled to go to mass today, even though like usually in DC I never go.
Gotcha. So you're like a church on the holidays kind of.
Yeah. Like with my family, we used to go more frequently. At least like once a month, basically, to church. But since coming here, I've completely. I don't know. It's a bit of a hassle without a car to get to church, even though I know there's one like literally within walking distance of my house.
Yeah.
It's just, I don't know. Also, like Sunday mornings, like we do this, so it's like there's a lot of time contradiction, especially like just a busy college life. It's I don't want to say it's hard because I know a lot of guys do it. I just don't have it high enough, and I think my time value pyramid to like really make time for. I think that's the real truth of it.
Yeah, for sure. I was also, I actually come from a mixed religion family. So my mom is Christian, my dad's Jewish. And I also come from one of those like go to church, synagogue only on the holidays kind of thing. Yeah, like coming to college, just like much lower on the priority list. I don't know if you're the same way, but I'm like, I have to be kind of dragged out to church or synagogue, but kicking and screaming. But
I wouldn't go kicking and screaming, but it would be nice if other people were trying to push me to go with them. I think I would go. And I think, honestly, like, it's a good thing. I like religiosity. I mean, I think it's a really good way to like find a bit of community. It's a very peaceful thing on like a Sunday morning, I think, to do. And then afterwards you go out and get lunch with your friends. Like that's what always my family did. We would meet up with my grandma at church, or we would pick up my grandma at her house, and then we would go to mass, and then we would get lunch together. It always ended up being like a very nice Sunday morning, and you feel good after going. At least I think I feel good after going to church. Maybe not holy, but I feel like like that was something nice. But I don't know. What were your experiences?
yeah, certainly. I mean, I'm also someone who I'm not very religious. I'm not very spiritual, but I agree in the sense that like every holiday, I always look forward to spending time with family.
Mm-hmm.
It's an event that, it's not the happiest thing. I'm not always looking forward to going out, but to your point, at the end of the day, I'm never regretting it because it's more of a chance that I get to spend with my family, and can't go wrong there.
Now, speaking of family, let's talk about another family. You have the Ox family.
Oh yeah, and the PolitiTeen podcast intern family.
Yes. What were your thoughts about the semester and kind of like how PolitiTeen has gone this year?
Yeah, certainly. So for context, I'm president of the Ox Institute, director of the PolitiTeen program. And this is the first year we're doing it as a cohort here at GW. And I'm sure we've talked about this on some other episodes, but probably not brought up as much.
Yeah.
This cohort, you guys have been here for a full academic year, started in fall 2024, wrapping up or heading into finals of the spring semester.
Yeah.
Last episode. I got to say, I'm overall pretty happy about how the semester's gone and how the year has gone. I mean, coming from, if you guys go back and watch the first episode of this show, coming back from like throwback. Shout out to Ren, our initial host, who unfortunately, due to some time conflicts, couldn't stay on. But going back to those first episodes, I think the first pilot episode we had you guys film, you guys did in over Zoom, right? It was like a Zoom recording.
Yes, that was terrible.
We gave these guys a summer assignment. Yeah, this is a real throwback. This is a real year recap.
That.
So we gave these guys a summer assignment where we were like, okay, we want to basically do a chemistry read between you and Ren from our perspective. And we were like, okay, we want to see kind of where's their baseline for when we can kind of, help them, teach them how to host, get more comfortable on the microphone. And we were like, okay, so you guys do a Zoom podcast over the summer, nothing too serious, just hit the record button and send it over to us. Right. I don't remember, we said by some random date closer to the school year. And I think the night before, I don't know if I forget, someone checked in with you guys. It was like, hey, is there did you guys work on this? Did you guys film it? And I don't remember who said this, but someone from the cohort was like, yeah, we filmed it. We're just trying to edit it right now. It's in the final stages. It's processing. It's uploading. So the next day we wake up and we get a submission of their first podcast. And it had the date on it that it was filmed the night before at 1 a.m. After they were like, yeah, we did this a minute ago. We were super.
It was prepared. 1 a.m, but it was the day before.
It was the day before, and when they recorded it on Zoom, they kept the barcode that has the time on it and the date. So I will say this cohort has come a long way from their early days.
In some ways.
In some ways, for sure. I think from there, at least, we've come a long way. I don't know if it's as far as I would like, but we've definitely come a long way.
No, I actually completely forgot about that. I remember I was sitting.
So what was this from your perspective? Because we laugh about this on our end all the time. This is a reoccurring.
Well, it's kind of sad we can't get the opinion of the other half of that. But I remember, I think the week before it was due, because Miles Strikes I, we were already friends. Then Ren was the one who we didn't we knew him. We were in the same group. He wasn't a friend between us three. So it's not like that. I'm not pointing him out to be in a the outsider way. That's just how it was, at least during the summer. So we were texting back and forth maybe the week before, a couple of days before. It's yeah, we just got to get this done. And I was like, yeah, we do. And we're well, we got it. So we had a group chat him, Ren, and stuff like that. And then I'm trying to remember. And then we were like, all right, yeah, well, let's just film and see how it goes. And I remember we created basically a really, really thin skeleton of what we wanted to talk about with 4 points and then a lot of bullet points. In retrospect, it was I think an overly created doc, one of those, but it was a really bad skeleton at the same time. Then I remember I sat down in my basement with I just sat on the couch of the basement because I know my dad I didn't want to wake up my dad and my mom or stuff like that.
So it was late at night.
Something like that. I don't remember. I went
not 1 a.m. but 12 a.m.
Who am I to say? But yeah,
I could pull up the timestamp, but I won't do that to you.
I remember just doing it in the basement, and then it was a lights were dark. It was just a dark room. You see my face. The only light I think was a bit of light over in the corner of the room, and then just the screen light hitting my face. So it was a disgusting video. And then Ren was just there, and I think we filmed it, and we were thinking about we thought about it in our head. We reviewing. We're should we refilm? And I think we were this close to just scrapping it and redoing the entire thing so that it would be a little more crisp. Which for what it came out to be is oof, for I don't know. I think for the first time it wasn't that bad. Now, did we totally wait last minute to do it? Yeah, but I mean,
Yeah, who doesn't?
It was a summer project. What do you expect from us? It was over the summer. You think we were actually gonna you know what I mean?
Yeah, no, I hear you. And I think something that I've seen you guys improve on a bit.
Patriot water, by the way.
Oh, wow. Oh, yeah, compared to my liberal tiers Starbucks frap.
I was at CVS. I totally impulse bought this. This is when you say the conservative and they try to sell gold to their consumers.
They found their target audience. You saw that and you were like, I cannot resist.
Yeah, dude, I'm never going to buy this again. But I got it just because I thought this would be funny to have around in class and stuff. But
I will say it works well for the podcast.
Yes. Patriot water. It's not actually called Patriot water, but I'm calling it Patriot water.
Teaser to our later conversation, later this episode, foreshadowing.
Anyways, as you were saying, sorry.
Oh, yeah. I think over the course of this year, something you guys have definitely gotten better at that I've liked to see improving is like fake it till you make it a little bit, right? Like learning how to submit things last minute and, kind of, trying to catch up, deal with any delays. I think you guys have gotten a lot better at, for lack of a better word, bullshitting.
Yeah, I mean, all my political views is basically are that just bullshitting and faking it till I make it, acting like I know what I'm talking about, but I don't.
Subtle foreshadowing number 2.
But yeah, I know. I mean, obviously bullshitting is a pretty big skill. The more also I live my life, the more I realize the incompetency of a lot of people and like how shocked I am that they're like in some of the roles they are.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, I am, of course, an entrepreneur. I started the Ox Institute with a couple friends of mine. Mm. And over the course of, starting it to getting at the point where we are now, right, where we have a full studio set up, what I think is a pretty cool setup. Also, it's pretty cool to be on this side of the microphone for once, with this setup here. But over the course of starting this company and getting it to the point where it is now, the number one thing I've learned is fake it till you make it.
Yeah.
Because what you find out over time, like you're saying, is that everyone's faking it. Mm-hmm. There's no adults in the room. No one really knows what they're doing. Everything is kind of hobbled together. You're all kind of following whoever came before you and trying to figure out how to, work with whatever you're left with a little bit better than the last guy. Mm-hmm. But no one really knows what they're doing. And the sooner you realize that, the much more successful you will be, because there's no one to wait for. There's no expert that's going to come along and tap you on the shoulder and be like, listen, you're doing this wrong. This is, X, Y, Z. At the end of the day, it's you.
Like, what was the process of you kind of figuring that out?
I think I kind of knew it from the start, right? I think as I came to college and as I just started, being around DC and, being in DC, you do kind of get, to some extent, that behind the scenes look. Mm-hmm. You get to hear from a lot of other people that are, involved in the political scene. See people that are working on the Hill, working in these think tanks. It becomes pretty apparent fairly quickly. I'm not sure if you got to this point or how long it took you, that like, oh, there's no actual like authority running anything. It's all just like kind of people that are all like bullshitting their way through it. Mm-hmm. Once I got to that point, and I think this was probably be around at least somewhere in the same period that we started the Ox Institute, I realized the more that you hold yourself back and think that, at some point I'll be more authoritative, I'll know what I'm doing, the less successful you're going to be, because at the end of the day, no one really is 100% confident in what they're doing. Mm-hmm. You just kind of build skills along the way. But the only way you build skills along the way is by actually doing it. So, I mean, that would be my 2 cents.
Okay. I mean, what this sounds a little bit of a weird question, but like, do you think that as people become more professional, more set up, do you think that bullshit decreases, or do you think that people will it's just like continuous no matter what? Like, you could be in the position of like, I don't know, Joe Rogan, and you're still going to be faking it a lot till you keep making it.
Yeah, I mean, I'll let you know when I get there.
Yeah.
But as of right now, I mean, let me rephrase, because it's not that everything is bullshit or that, everything is just totally hobbled together and no one knows what they're doing. I think over time, as you do it, you start to build expertise. You start to build that kind of level of professionalism almost.
And it gets a bit more real.
It gets a bit more real. It's kind of like, again, it's literally the fake it till you make it. And I'm somewhere along that spectrum. I don't think I'm fully there yet. But as you keep going, it just becomes more serious. It becomes a little bit more real. Mm. So it's not necessarily that you're still bullshitting, because, the fake it till you make it. Once you start to make it, it becomes pretty fucking real. You get some tangibles along the way. Mm-hmm. So I'm trying to think. I mean, I do think that at some point, in some sense, everyone is just bullshitting. I don't think anyone has the right answer per se, and if they're pretending they do, they're lying to you. Mm-hmm. I think we all just are kind of figuring that out along the way.
Okay. So then, we talked a little bit about the kind of the year in review. What are some of the you think critiques or things that could have went better this year?
From like my perspective or from y'all's perspective?
Your perspective. And it could be including what we could have done better, stuff like that.
Yeah, certainly. I think something that I've learned throughout the first year of doing this program is, first of all, starting a program, doing the first year of any program.
Yeah, we should probably mention that this was the first. This is the
first cohort. So, on that note, also, I do have to thank all of you guys because, with the first year of any program, there's a lot of figuring shit out. In the beginning, our number one challenge that we never anticipated is once the cohort and the year actually started, finding a common time where we could all meet and 2 common times was the biggest road bump we actually faced. Mm-hmm. And from there, we had another road bump of trying to find a room. The first couple episodes were filmed in like our various apartments or dorms, just trying to make it work. So, I think...
And now we're here in a studio.
Yeah, and now we're here in an actual studio. So I think in that regard, we've come really far and, I'm really happy with it. I think, the first year, there's so much figuring it out. There's so much logistics, subtle things that you wouldn't even think about. Mm-hmm. Like finding a consistent room that's booked. If a club has that reserved for one day out of the year, what are you going to do? It kind of scrambles your whole plans. Mm-hmm. Just like small things, making sure the equipment is together, transporting the equipment back and forth when we were doing this in, just kind of some reserved classrooms as opposed to an actual space. So I think, it's been a major learning experience, I think, for me. I've been the, director of this program, so I've been kind of overseeing a lot of the, the lecture series, the attendance, the structure of it. So, of course, I think on my end, something that I definitely want to have improved, that I think we've improved this semester, but certainly with the next cohort, is we now will be fortunate enough to start at the level that we are now. Right? It's taken a year to kind of build PolitiTeen to this point from mm-hmm. kind of, again, like the Zoom recording that was submitted super last minute, mm-hmm. Filming in random apartments with, our transporting our equipment all over the place, up until the point where, we have a well-defined course. Mm-hmm. We have lectures that are, ready to go to kind of teach you guys the various skills that we've picked up along the way. I think there's a lot that has come together over the course of the year that I'm excited for the next cohort. And I think that the number one thing that I've learned is kind of being able to start at that baseline. I'm really excited to do, because I will say from my perspective, I think a big mistake that I made and a big mistake that we all made when starting this program was I think we started it on the wrong foot to some extent. I think the early stages of the program, we were trying to balance that dynamic of the fact that we are also students, right? Like we're upperclassmen to you guys, but we're not that far apart in age or in class year.
Right.
So trying to balance that, like,
or even fraternity brothers.
Yeah, exactly. Which is a whole other dynamic that I think got in the mix.
Yeah.
So I think starting on a level that, we're trying to figure out how to create a professional atmosphere while at the same time not being so serious that we can't also be students and can't also just chat. Mm-hmm. So I think we started a little bit too much on the casual foot, and I think that definitely harmed a lot of last semester. Mm-hmm. But I think as we figured it out and gotten more serious, it's helped to improve the program. But I do think that the initial tone you set, this is something else that I learned over the course of doing this, the initial tone that you set with anything you do in life, right? Whether it's, starting a new program, going to, taking a new class, picking up anything that's new, starting a new job, the mindset that you go into it and the culture that you create with the people around you at the start of anything will impact it throughout its life and throughout your time with that.
Yeah.
So I think by starting and creating a culture that was more casual, it was a lot more difficult to kind of rein it in as we were trying to get more serious and as we were trying to figure it out. So I think that's something that I've learned that I think harmed, your guys' ability to perform because of that culture. And, also our ability to try and, structure the course and structure the program. So I know that was long-winded, but all that goes to say, I think, the culture that you create with the people around you is very important. Mm. And I think that's the number one lesson that I've learned and that, I'm looking ahead to when, we're starting a new cohort.
Oh, I completely agree. I think it's hard to change a culture or morph a culture, but it's easy to create, strike when the iron's hot and to kind of set a tone, and then from there, just coast and maintain than it is to just, change. And that was definitely felt, joining last semester and kind of like coming into this semester, how different you guys basically were poised, and like how the structure of it was a lot more like formal. which I think ended up being a good thing. I think that, because like you said, how casual it was like the first semester, this was a couple episodes, especially with like our cohort, it would never have the formalities never struck as deep as maybe they should be. Because like I said, we already had an established culture, established idea of PolitiTeen, and it's hard to change that. But I definitely think the tone that you guys set for the second semester was this, I think, much better balance that for the next group, if they start with it and maintain, I think it would be good for them. So
yeah, certainly. And I think to your point as well, it is also trying to balance these competing cultures, right? There's a general student culture of just trying to, be more casual with each other, right? We have enough strictness going on in our, other aspects of life, whether it's in classes or, any other job that we have.
DC is a pretty hierarchical city.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. And everyone is super serious all the time.
Yeah.
No one shows any emotion out in the city whatsoever. Super cold.
The happy hours are barely happy.
And the happy hours, people are looking way too serious.
Yeah.
And, I think we're trying to balance that culture of like, we have the student interpersonal culture, right? Then, like you were saying, also the frat culture. With the culture of trying to build a program.
Right.
I think we definitely got that balance way wrong when we started. And trying to course correct, to your point, after that is tough. But I think we did a decent job. And I'm definitely excited for, the next cohort, but also sad to see you guys go a little bit. That intro definitely hit a lot harder than I thought it would.
Yeah, I mean, it's bittersweet because if I'm gonna be like completely honest, there were like some things, like some days I would wake up and I'd be like, this fucking program, man. Like, God, especially like, because we film on Sunday mornings, like, well, Sunday, like, they're on Sunday at 10. And some mornings I wake up because, like Saturday I'm doing, like, I'm out or something. And I wake up and I'm like, fuck, like, I can't believe I agreed to Sunday and like just doing this. It's like, oh. And also I just like, also I just feel like there's a bit of insecurity as being like this young college kid talking about politics. It's like, I mean, it's nice to have the youth perspective, but sometimes I feel like, maybe it's like my conservatism talking, like maybe someone a bit more older with more expertise, more venerable, you know what I mean? But I mean, I don't think that's deterred me from like giving my opinions on things. And I don't think that's an excuse to have like young people shut up. I'm far from it. But, sometimes I just wake up in the morning and I'm like, I'm doing a podcast. I'm talking about my politics. It's like, I don't really know what's going on. I don't, not to the degree of like some of these other people in the world. Like I'm still so green and I'm talking here trying to seem like I'm an authority figure. And it just seems like really, fake it till you make it. It just feels like to some degree like a little disingenuous.
I hear you on that. And I think, again, going back to our earlier conversation, no one really knows what they're talking about, right?
Yeah.
People can pretend, people can gain more experience, like you're saying, gain more knowledge about certain issues. But even then, the more you learn about a specific topic, almost the more your blinders go up to other things as well.
Mm-hmm.
Once you learn something, it also ends up, you internalize that and it can kind of rule other things out.
Mm-hmm.
So, I think I disagree with the premise that, age necessarily can create wisdom, or that you must be older in order to be able to have a certain level of wisdom or a certain level of knowledge. I think, for a long time, younger people have been kind of excluded from a lot of conversations.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that can be very harmful in a lot of ways. I think our generation and every generation has a very unique experience of the world that I think is important to get out there and important to share.
Right.
It's part of what helped us be so successful with the Aux Institute. Up until this point and going forward is the fact that, we have an advantage being in this generation, particularly in social media, in the social media space. And that's not the only advantage that our generation has, right? Mm-hmm. Our ability to kind of suss out information and kind of be able to almost have like a bullshit detector that I think some older generations don't have as much because they come from a much higher level of trust, right, in their generation versus, our generation, where we come from a very highly skeptical generation, I think. Mm-hmm. In some ways, I think in others, we kind of just take a whole heap of bullshit happily, but with a smile on our face. But I like to think at least that, we
have to pick our battles.
Yeah, exactly. Growing up in this age, I think we're a little bit better at being skeptical, but that also means being critical, right? Yeah. And having those critical thinking skills, having that ability to kind of, think a little bit more deeply about issues that I think, not to say everyone in our generation is amazing at that, but I do think our generation has certain advantages that I think can be undermined by those kinds of appeals to authority.
Well, I mean, I would definitely agree with you that age doesn't mean wisdom. Just because you're older, I know like there are some young people who really travel the world or have experienced certain things that some guy just might not have. It doesn't necessarily equate. And you could have like a 20-year-old who's like a relative expert on something, and then have some 60-year-old who has no idea what it is.
Yeah,
I totally agree to that. But I don't think that necessarily takes away from that. I should also say I've talked to a lot of older people who are just living in their own political bubble. Very weird. There's definitely a class of Americans who are completely like Fox CNN pilled, and I just don't know where to even begin with them. But that being said, and they're the ones who usually use their authority the most, like when talking to you in conversation. Yes, I've had a lot of conversations with my uncles and aunts about politics. But anyways,
yeah, I think I've noticed that. I think age tends to correlate more with like interpersonal kind of life wisdom a little bit. Of course, there's definitely older people that are super immature, whether it be emotionally or whatever. But I do think that like interpersonally, a lot of times I feel like I tend to get much better advice from older people than I get good political takes from older individuals.
Yeah.
And I think, it has to do with the fact that we have a unique kind of our own kind of media bubble. We are kind of pilled from the media that we consume. Exactly.
We're just taking a different pill. Yeah, different dealer.
Yeah, literally. A different dealer of like YouTube and TikTok versus their, CNN, Fox.
MSNBC.
Newsmax. We could do this.
Yeah. Newsmax.
MSDNC.
No, well, I mean, on both ways, it's both equally like weird to look at, to be honest. Just the complete pilling of like TV news, basically. It's TV news. It's a really weird, different beast. But I think going back to it, I don't think that necessarily, because, you're young, we should discount your opinions, but I just think it's a little weird that, well, okay, I should frame it this way first. I think it's good that young people are pushing to have a greater voice. I think it's right. We are the inheritors of this planet. And, a lot of the policies that are created now are going to impact us for the rest of our lives, while a lot of people are, kind of starting to get out the door. However, I do think that, people tend to, I think, overcorrect to some degree. And I think there's a bit of, at least in my view, like youth chauvinism going on, where I think the appeals to young people because of their, they would say because we're the future, because we are, forward thinking, we care about the 30-year plan. I think we kind of disregard some of the concerns or some of the warnings of the older generation who were once young, who are once in a position like ours, to be honest, like ranting against the older generation. And I'm sure when we get older, there's going to be a younger generation that's going to rant against us. And we're going to tell them, no, you don't know yet. Once you get into the real world. And I think, there has to be a balance between those two kind of forces of the young people wanting change and reform. And I think the older people also wanting it, but also maybe knowing some of the mistakes that we're going to make. And I think that with with social media and having the young voice so much more amplified than ever before, in my opinion, I think it's a good thing overall, but we got to be careful not to overuse and start overemphasizing, I think, the young voice, if that makes sense.
No, I mean, I totally hear you. And I think this is kind of, gets into the second conversation that I wanted to have a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
I think this almost explains maybe the difference in our politics to some extent.
Mm-hmm.
For full transparency, I'm a progressive. I know throughout, this year and hearing your takes, you tend to be on the conservative side.
Yeah.
I don't want to misrepresent you or mislabel you.
Yeah.
And I think that kind of represents that divide almost perfectly,
Mm-hmm.
where I think I am more ready to kind of say, recognize issues in the way that we've been running things, right? In the way that society operates, in the way that our social structure works. Kind of analyze that, see the issues, see some of the outcomes that it produces that are, very harmful for certain people,
Mm-hmm.
and try and right those wrongs and set the next generation up after us to be in a position to right those wrongs again, and to kind of progress in a direction towards social justice, towards equity. And I think, a lot of times the kind of conservative side, like you're saying, is very, you want to keep in mind that older generation, right? The kind of old guard, preserving some of the values in our society to try and ensure that, it doesn't get lost. And, I think to an extent, every generation is going to preserve the last generation, right? We all kind of learn from the people we're raised by. We kind of are, we grew up in their society. We, as much as we can kind of create a culture amongst ourselves, and like the younger generation, we have our own culture. That culture is entirely shaped by who came before us and the social system that we're raised in. So I think you're always going to kind of preserve some of that. And I think the goal of the younger generation should be to try and, push society towards a better direction, towards a direction that, is materially better for everyone in society. Whereas I think, the older generation, as you get older, right, you do get more experience. But as you get that experience, it also makes those experiences that you've had more real and therefore more objective, I think. And so I think it can also kind of cloud your perspective, wherein, and again, this is not to say all people, this is of course a generalization. I think as we get older, we tend to internalize a lot of the things that are around us, which can cause us to put those blinders on. It's difficult for us as we live increasingly in the world and as we experience the world and as we move through it to imagine the world being different. And I think when you're younger, that imagination hasn't died yet. It's still very fresh. It's still, there's almost a fire there. Whereas as you live through this world, as you kind of internalize the society around you, it becomes more unchanging, and then I think you end up projecting that out into the world.
I don't necessarily think that's true. I think as we're young, we do create this conception of what the world we want to see, and I think that as you get older, it just ossifies more. But I don't think it's because, I think as young people, we're not creating 10 different imaginations the world is. I think you have a conception of maybe one general direction of where we're going, where you want to see us go. And I think as you get older, you're not getting less imaginative. You just get more set on it. So,
interesting. So you don't think that the goal of where you think we should go changes?
No, because I talked to some older people.
Yeah.
I mean, this is aside from as you get older, maybe you have some experience that changes your politics. Maybe when I was younger, I was more liberal, and then as I get older, I get more conservative because of XYZ factors. But for lifelong liberals or lifelong conservatives, I don't see that they're necessarily their end goal or their end values change. What I just see is that they become a lot more ossified in their positions or a lot more set in them. But that doesn't mean that their vision for America or vision for the world has gone less imaginative. When I talk to some my grandfather, who passed away unfortunately, but he was a lifelong Democrat, and my grandma's a lifelong Republican. So it's funny because we'd always say, you guys shouldn't vote. You guys should just stay home because you cancel each other out. Right. But he was always, and I remember talking to him, he was always a lot more of working man, blue collar, we got to help the working man. And it's wrong that these rich, he always had that concept, the country club Republican kind of view. He's they're just out for themselves. And, we need to have, more values like that. And hearing him talk about it, he sounds like some of the young people today with some of his talking points. And, again, in an objective way, not in a down talking, but he sounds like a young people today where his core values and his vision for America is very similar to the younger people today. And what I see in him is that not that he got less imaginative, he still very much is very imaginative of that American more equal future. It's just that he's just settled on it a lot more and he's thought about it a lot more, and he's a lot more confident to say, no, I've lived my life. This is the view. This is the vision. And to be honest, if you asked him that 50, 60 years ago, I think he would have given you, even if not exact, the same direction of an answer, maybe with a bit less confidence. And I think it's the exact same way with my grandma, just in the other direction.
Yeah.
So.
No, I certainly think that's true. I think, as we get older, we tend to get a little bit more solidified in our viewpoints. But I also think that the world becomes more solidified. And what I mean by that is I I think you tend to see a lot of old people, and again, this is a generalization, and it doesn't apply to everyone. I think they tend to take a lot more of that realist attitude, right? Particularly older conservatives, where the idea is, I've seen the world, you haven't, right? And because I've kind of seen the world, right? I've lived a much longer life than you. I know what the world is really like. I've seen that perspective, and therefore what you're saying doesn't work. I've heard that a lot as a progressive.
Yeah.
From particularly older conservatives. And I do think that, part of the reason that is kind of those structures become more real as you live your life and as you internalize them more. And we're a society that's very much set up we're a society that's run by and operated by the older generation, right? The older generation sets the rules. I think that's pretty clear. And I think because they set the rules and they tend to have this realist perspective, I think regardless, I think even older progressives tend to, I don't think that their vision, to your point, has become less imaginative. I think they have, they tend to become more set in whatever their vision is. But I do think that, they, at the same time, also recognize that, the world that they're pushing for is, I think it becomes more difficult to achieve almost, or feels more difficult to achieve as you get older, because you kind of see the world almost, you internalize that perspective and it feels very real. Everything that our society is doing and the way that we're doing it seems so real because it is real, right? It's how we operate. But when it's also kind of run and the rules are set by that same older generation, it can end up making it just kind of, you get that conservative through line, which I see as a hindrance to progress in many cases, right? Progress. Which I'm sure, you
well, I mean,
it
depends what you mean as progress. If you consider progress like the march towards more equality and the march towards like just greater material, like wealth for everyone, see, like I view progress as a bit more complex than that, because I think that if we were all like equally impoverished, or if we were all like equally kind of mid-tier, but we were like how do I put this? I view progress not necessarily as like this linear like progression towards equality or material wealth. I view progress as a lot more of a I don't want to say spiritual, because when I say the word spiritual, it gets into this weird like voodoo esoteric like degree of like the soul, and like that's not what I mean when I like I mean like I don't know how to say this in like a very like common man way, but like I think progress is a lot more person based, if that makes sense. Where if I had if I created a society where there's a lot of money and everyone was like relatively equal, let's just say economically I was able to do that, but the people were all, I think, like culturally rootless. They were just like endless consumers, or like they didn't really have like identities, they didn't really have families. Like I don't know if I would call that progress. I think there's a lot more to progress than like the material means. There's, I think, a deeply saddled like spiritual side that also people forget about. And obviously this is to say the conservative doesn't say we don't want more quality and we don't want more like wealth for everyone. Like I think that's a straw man that people make. The conservatives like inequality. They just want to preserve the elites. There's some kleptocrats out there who are like, yeah, that is me. But like, I'm a conservative, but at the same time, I would like to see a more equal society. I would like to see like more people with wealth. But I think that some of the charges that the progressives make towards this kind of goal of progress with a capital P, I think it's a little concerning, because I think progressives leave a lot out. And then also because progressives are so sure on a direction, I think they're willing to do a lot of things to get there that I think are long-term harmful to society, because they're focused on this idea of what is progress, where the conservative says, we're not starting at a place of this is shit. We're starting at a place of actually, this is really cool. Society does have a lot of problems, but we went from cave dwellers to here. We've gone from, lawless society to a society with laws and systems with protections for people. There's a lot here worth preserving, and a lot here that we should carry on. But we didn't get there, you know, we didn't get there just by ideologically thinking, you know, for example, oh, we want this and that. A lot of it came from tradition. A lot of it came from established norms that were carefully cultivated over many, many years. And now they become rather solidified now, but this is a very careful cultivation. And, you know, Edmund Burke said, you know, what, and I'm going to butcher this quote, but he's like, what, like, fury and anger and, like, what do you call it? Like, not thinking things through can do to a society in a few hours will undo what deliberation and tradition has created for like 100 years.
Yeah, and remind me, Burke says that your rights are historical, or he says they're ethnic. I forget.
I don't
Or a
remember.
mix.
It's a bit of a mix because they're based off the
It's
society.
national, right?
It's based off the society that creates it. So he takes a historical heritage to a lot of things, where I think he's very like civic rights focused, where he's like, because we have to remember there's also time before like kind of the idea of, or not, he kind of argues against this idea of like these ethereal universal human rights to a degree, where he says these are all nice in theory, basically having all these human rights, but the only practical rights are the rights that you have with your society, the civic rights that are enshrined and agreed upon. So for example, in the United States, we agree to the rights, or we have the rights as given, not given, they aren't given. We agree to the rights that are stated in the Constitution. And our long tradition and our long heritage has enabled us to reach this point, which is really cool. But he's saying, what he says is that, you know, these rights, not only are they more real, but they're more important than anything else than, like, for example, universal human rights, because our institutions, our structures, our understanding of America are fundamentally wrapped around it. Something like human rights, which are, you know, a lot more idealistic, and, you know, we have international criminal courts and stuff like that, but we're talking at the national level here because I think that's more important. Our institutions, they're not built around that. We just have this idea, but at the end of the day, you know, if our government violates, you know, universal human rights, there's not as much we can do about it because the society around it, the traditions, the culture hasn't genuinely been reflected in what we have created. So I don't know the better way of putting this. It's like,
I think, to give my perspective here, I think, you know, I actually agree with a lot of what you're saying. But I think, you know, to that last point, I think a lot of what we see around us is precisely a result of what came before. So I think, you know, that tradition has, to your point, led us to where we are now. It defines what we think is good, what we think is right and wrong, is defined by our history, right? And to your point, you know, we've decided that as a group, right? And I guess that national level has become more prominent. I think, you know, where I kind of diverge from, I think, how you think of progressives is I don't think that progress is linear. I don't necessarily believe that the arc of history bends towards justice.
oh yeah,
And I do kind of, I think it's, you know, it ebbs and flows. I think it's very nebulous. I think, you know, we can go in any direction. We can go in directions that are better for people, and we can go in directions that are worse for people. And I think the level that I start at isn't necessarily the nation, or even, you know, the international, you know, like you were saying, kind of with these notions of universal human rights. I think I start at the level of the individual. And what I mean by that is I think, you know, every individual needs to be able to be free from violence. And I think that's my fundamental perspective, is I think we as a society should, and this is an argument that I would make, push to eliminate violence from our society as much as we possibly can. And I think that, you know, that kind of conservative perspective of trying to preserve a lot of the good things we've achieved through, you know, it almost does seem like you have this idea of a linear progress, right? Where it's like, as long as we kind of preserve these norms that have gotten us to the point where we are now, they'll continue to get us towards a better direction.
No, that's not necessarily true. I don't think it's linear progress, but to me, it's like you're building a house on a foundation. It's smart to keep the foundation And if you're gonna rebuild the house without the foundation, you better create a really good new foundation. But it's hard to make that foundation. So, like the way I view like society is not as long as we maintain to the traditional norms, we're going to keep going in the good direction. It's very possible that the norms are holding us back, and you can have societies with terrible, terrible foundations, and they should be stripped and removed as they should be. But that's for that society themselves to decide, not me. I live in the American society. I think there are parts of the foundation that are good and parts of the foundation that do need, renovating or changing even. They're completely stripping out. But I don't view progress in the sense of like, it's progress to me is just like, it's there. It's like this, it's not a real term in my opinion. Not a real term. Yeah. It's not a real term to me. There's technological progress. You mean the technology gets better. There's economic progress. People are more economically liberated and stuff like that. Those are all, good things, but they're just kind of trends that happen. And I think the only progress that happens really is within the individual with themselves. Are they, achieving the most that they themselves can be? Are they satisfied with their own life?
Yeah. See, this is where I 100% disagree with you.
Yeah.
I think progress is, where I was saying it all comes back to the individual. I agree that it does come back to the individual and the state that they're doing. However, I think that that individual is only able to succeed if they are in a society that allows them to.
I agree.
And I think, when I say pushing for a society of less violence, how I define violence broadly, I think, is preventable death or preventable harm. So
preventable. So
the idea of it being preventable, right? If I were to obviously,
right, but like, okay, question.
Yeah.
You want to minimize violence. So, well, actually, there's a few things I want to go on violence about this. Two boxers fighting in a ring, is that violence?
No.
Why?
Because they both consent to being in that position.
So it's unconsensual preventative harm?
I would say unconsensual harm tends to be a bar. I think, again, going back to the fact that it matters to each individual, I think each individual has their own, idea of what violence would be to that person to some extent, but that is defined by, the structure that they're in as well.
Right, because
so I think, you could have a masochist who wants to, feel physical pain, and I don't think that them doing that would necessarily be violence because they're enjoying it.
Interesting,
but I do think that, broadly, the vast majority of people don't want to be homeless. And I think the fact that we have 70 vacant homes for each person who's homeless in this country is a crime. I think that's violence. I think the idea that 1 in 7 children in this country are experiencing food insecurity, I think that's a form of violence. It's not something that these people, are enjoying, that these people want to be doing. It's a structure that's put in, children with food insecurity, right? That can be solved with a very simple policy. Universal school lunches, it's been done in certain states. It's been done in New York City. Can prevent what I see as a form of violence, which is the fact that, our society is preventing these children from having food, despite the fact that we have a massive surplus of food. I think that's a form of violence. And I think that's what I mean. And I think you can kind of see fringe cases where, something that would be violence to one person wouldn't be for another. And I think, everyone has the freedom, I guess, if you want to go starve yourself, if you don't want to eat. But, I think everyone should have the ability to be able to have food. And I think that's what I mean when I say I want to push for a world with less violence. I think these deaths are entirely preventable. And the fact that we're not preventing them, the fact that we're not preventing people from starving, the fact that, we're not trying to provide everyone with housing and drinking water, I think that is a form of violence that's enacted by the society that we live in. And we need to progress for a society with less violence. And that's my overall argument. And I think sometimes conservative values can get in the way of that.
That's an interesting definition of violence in my view.
Because I think overall, right, you see the argument a lot of times from conservatives that we've been able, because of the tradition, because of, the tradition that we stem from, to curtail violence, to eliminate it to some degree, right? We have less wars, we have less people being murdered. However, I think that by the metric of preventable death, we haven't actually gotten that far. As we've progressed and as we've been less, we've actively killed each other less, as, we shoot each other a lot less than we did during, the 20th century. And, we're not as at each other's throats as we were during the caveman days. Yet there's a lot more people that, could be experiencing a peaceful life that are not because of the way that we've set up our society.
I think you're you're looking at the glass pretty half empty here. I think when you look at the course of history, we've by and large been able to stop many great famines from occurring. Especially, I'll start in a sense around. In every era, in every society, there have been a lot of people left behind. A lot of people, I guess, by your definition, who experienced violence. A lot of it had to do with the state, and a lot to do with, I guess what someone would consider like these traditional values of like nationalism and all that stuff. There were also a lot of people who were harmed because of just economic means or, famines or just natural worldly events.
Certainly.
As the world is progressing, we are entering a more, peaceful time, which I think is relative, by the way. This relative peace that we're having and stuff, I can't promise it's going to stay this way. I think this could just be a temporary time of peace. We could enter a more violent era as we get older. But what you tend to focus on here, I think, is what you consider like preventable crimes by like the lack of action or the choice of not acting and intervening on those who are in need. But what I tend to see, I think, in history is that we have gone, and this is, I think, where your starting point is here, rather than looking maybe a little bit farther back. And I guess this is the question is like, where do you start looking? How far back do you go when you look at society, right? When I look back far enough in history, or if you just look back far enough, you're going to see throughout history massive famines who affected, millions of people dying, especially like in the Indian subcontinent, where there's been massive famines every like 25 years, where like thousands and hundreds of thousands would die. And in America, we've had tragedies where we've had like the Dust Bowl in the Midwest, where life was like damn near close to extreme poverty. Damn near close. There was extraordinary poverty, extraordinary levels in our country. While you had the elites on the coast.
Yeah, I mean, even today, we're the wealthiest country in the world, and we have over 700,000 people that are homeless.
No, I
think don't have a place to sleep.
I completely agree, and I think the conservative response isn't it sucks for them. They gotta actually for some it's like pull yourself up with the bootstraps. But that's so stupid in my opinion. But my response is yes, there is still a lot more we have to get done. There's still a shit ton that I wish we did. But we already have done an extraordinary amount. And I think it reflects the nature of humans wanting to help. I think everyone looks at those people in need. And everyone sees, the fact that we have more housing than we do. We have more housing we have enough housing that we could like home every homeless person. And I think just by your gut instinct as a human, we all agree this is really terrible. But I think the progressive response is pretty much, all right, this is easy. We got to solve it. And, we're just going to change it. We got to, it's illegal. We got to, not illegal. It's violence and we got to prevent it. The conservative response is, yeah, this is terrible. This is not good. And we do need to address it. But we need to address it in a way that is smart without compromising our systems and in a way that'll be healthy for the whole of society. And I'm sure you would say, oh, it is healthy for the whole society if, we stop this violence, we integrate them, and we're able to give them a home. But my view is that, if it means giving everyone a home, it means we seize a bunch of assets of like these more corporations and just put the homeless people in those houses, I have an urge in my chest to do that because, it's like prevent the violence and who cares about these corporations and stuff like that. But there's broad implications for what we do, secondary effects, tertiary effects, and we can't be hasty with it because the consequences of our actions and the consequences, especially in such a developed system like we have far wrong consequences that need to be considered first.
Yeah. My response to that is I think you have the ability to wait for these people to get housing.
Mm-hmm.
On my commute here, I probably walked by a dozen homeless people,
mm-hmm.
people who slept on the street last night.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think that we can afford to wait because of the level of violence that these people are experiencing. That's entirely preventable. And I think I have less of a will or a desire to kind of try and preserve these systems. I think we need to take the systems as they are and adapt them to try and, bring as many people into the fold. And I don't think we'll be able to do it instantly.
That takes time.
No, certainly. But I think it needs to happen a hell of a lot quicker than it is now.
It's not just I have the ability, I have the responsibility. I have the responsibility to wait because I'm going to say it would cause more violence if we just try to help them out in all these ways. And then through it, we end up destroying our law and order. We end up destroying our society through it just in the name of stopping this violence here, we're end up creating a lot of violence by disrupting the system that brought security to a lot of people in this country.
Well, see, I think these are very big leaps that I think.
Well, it depends on the case.
I don't necessarily.
It depends on the case.
I will say it. I mean, I think it does depend on the case. However, I think I'm someone that I lean towards the idea that we should try and help these people deal with the consequences. We, of course, need to think about how we're doing it. We need to try and adapt our systems. And like I said, take them as they are and try and adapt them to help these people. I think doing, to your point, entirely upending the system and some, violent revolution would be a terrible solution to this problem, right? It would be one way. You could just have people go, if you don't have a home, just go seize a random house.
Right.
That would be one way to make everyone housed that I think would cause more violence than it's actually preventing. However, I think we need to actually take measures to do this. And I think there are going to be people's interests that are going to get in the way because we have set up a system, and the current system we have right now inherently makes people selfish. Yeah, and I think part of that, right, the basis into the system we have right now is the profit incentive. Mm-hmm. The idea that, we need to make profit and we will do that at whatever cost. Well, I think that has consequences that, are extremely harmful to a lot of people in society, right? That get on the other end of the stick, right? That aren't fortunate enough to, be able to kind of make this profit and end up being the expense that it takes so that, like you're saying, a lot of corporations can have, let's say buy up 100 homes to, shore up their real estate value while, that are sitting vacant while people are, miles away sleeping on the ground.
Well, don't get me wrong. I'm a conservative, but also like in many ways I'm better described maybe as a right populist. Because I have a feeling that a lot of your programs, stuff that you want to implement to fix a lot of these issues, I would actually agree with And, I am capitalist, not skeptic, but I'm very well aware of the destructive aspects of capitalism as well as the constructive. So in all those respects, like I actually completely agree with you there. And that there are a lot of structures that, fight against good reform. But at the same time, and I'm not like straw man, like saying that progressives want to like destroy society and stuff like that. But these same structures that, use the phrasing commit violence, I wouldn't view it that way.
So do you think homelessness is violence?
No.
Interesting. So do you think that, where does the responsibility for homelessness lie? Because I would argue...
It depends. Yeah. Okay. If you're like a mentally ill individual, which most homeless people are, I think it's up to the society to help them because they are in the state that they are.
Yeah.
I would say I wouldn't use a blanket term like homelessness is violence or like, it's their fault or that. It depends on what's going on. Like a mentally ill person, society should take up the reins and help them. A totally capable human being who just chooses not to work and do that stuff, then it would be on them. An individual who got injured and couldn't work anymore, society should have safety nets to protect them. It depends on who. But I don't think it's necessarily violence. I think when I think of violence, actually, maybe I have a different understanding of violence, firstly. Violence to me, I don't think is positive or negative. It just is. When a lion kills and eats an antelope, there's a lot of violence in that interaction. But I wouldn't say that the lion is inherently doing a bad thing, killing the antelope to survive, So because of that, I don't view violence in this negative conception, which is why I wouldn't use the term violent. Now, in the modern day lexicon, domestic violence, stuff like that, like, yeah, there's a very charged negative, underpinning to it. But I think if you take violence in and of itself, it simply is. Like a hammer. No moral justification to a hammer. It's simply a tool. Violence is simply a thing that happens.
Yeah, where I would agree with you on the hammer, I think if I were to take that hammer and commit an act of violence with it, I think that would be a bad thing.
Right, but is the hammer bad?
No, but I think the violence that's being inflicted by it is bad.
But then is
And I
the
think
violence...
we can argue that...
Wait, but is the violence that the lion inflicts on the deer bad?
Well, you're talking to a vegetarian, and
Okay,
I would say...
Actually, yes, this
I
makes
would
a lot
say
of sense.
the answer is yes.
Okay, this makes a lot of sense, actually. I didn't know that you were a vegetarian.
I am a vegetarian, so I would say the answer is yes. But for the purpose of a political conversation, and I don't think that that's a violence that, I think we are in the ability to address.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason I also don't think that's violence is, remember my definition of preventable harm. It's
Right,
not just any...
But that's what I mean. I don't see violence as needing to have the qualifier preventable.
You think violence is just any form of harm? Because, see, what I would say, right, is if, let's say we didn't have enough houses, right, and we actually did not have supply enough to be able to make sure that everyone had shelter...
Then homelessness wouldn't be violence?
No, I think it would be a bad thing. I think we should try and prevent it. Right? I think we should try and build more homes so that people could have it. And I think if we had the capacity to do that, it would be violent. However, I think that once you're at the point where you have the ability to house people and you deliberately don't because of the way that we set up our structure to no fault of these people, I think that's violence.
I think that's a really...
I think deliberate harm is violence. I think harm itself is not violent. I think it's bad. It's harmful, obviously.
Yeah.
But
No,
I think,
yes, but...
That deliberate aspect, which I think comes with the preventability.
Right. I don't agree with that defining of... I don't want this to turn I don't want this to turn like a 40-minute discourse on what violence means. But, I don't agree with that definition of violence. And I think that then the subsequent use of the term violent it's very societally charged in a negative aspect.
So then let's take away the word and just talk about the concept that I'm talking about.
Right, homelessness.
Yeah. Well, also, homelessness being one of the forms of preventable harm. I think, starvation is another when we live with such a massive food surplus.
But I don't know. But see, I think harm is a very different thing because would you say, okay, because you would say that if we didn't have enough houses, we'd have enough food, then, homelessness is not violence. It would be harmful, but not violence.
Yeah, it would be harmful,
Right.
but it's not preventable.
Right.
There's nothing we can do about it.
Right. So then if we go back to let's say we go back to, let's just do I'll just drop that point regardless. Well, we'll just say it's harmful, regardless of whether that was preventable or not. Then the responsibility is on society mostly to solve it. But that doesn't mean, for example, how do I put this? We already do things to help a lot of the homeless. Now, they're not enough. We need to do more of it. We've done a lot more than what we used to do to help the homeless. And I would say to find solutions and through the conservative mind to actually address homelessness better, they have to be, and okay, so this is really hard because this goes into a lot of, okay, well, I'm going to try to word this and then go through it. We need a solution that actually does real reduction. And the conservative mind is that, and a lot of the context of today is that we have all these programs in place, a lot of these social programs. Okay. And we look at the results that they actually do. And we say, are they really helping people in an effective manner? And the conservative says, well, practically not really.
I would say practically not at all. I think a lot of times it can even make it worse on current solutions.
Yeah, I actually would agree with you in a lot of ways. Yes.
Oh, 100%. I mean, yes. I'm not a fan of the ways that we're dealing with homelessness now. I mean, you can look at it. Our rates are rising every year. Now, our rates are rising per capita, not to mention the overall homeless population. We're almost at 800,000 now.
But I would hesitate to say that the Republican response is the conservative response, firstly. Let me just make that very, very clear. The Republicans are a party, the same way the Democrats are a party. They're not an ideology, a way of looking at it. They might subscribe a little bit closer, but like the Republican response to things is not necessarily my response. My response to things is a lot more like yours, to be honest. There's a lot of agreement here, which is why I think it's hard to talk about this when I think a lot of people think conservative, think Republican.
Yeah, and I guess here's my take. I think that, to your point, conservatives are not Republicans. I think, however, you mentioned capitalism before. We live in this system that, values profit over all else. And I think that's a system that the Republican Party is very much trying to conserve.
There's a lot
of
the
Democratic Party is trying to conserve as well. Oh, yeah, no. Yeah. I wouldn't disagree with that at all. I think, however, there's an approach that I take where, I'm not one where I want to throw out capitalism completely, right? I think, to your point, we've progressed a lot technologically from it. However, I think we need to be willing to move away from that profit incentive into a better system for certain aspects of our society. I think a lot of the issues with how we've been addressing homelessness are that we've been doing it through the private sector. Yeah. And once you have someone trying to make profit on housing, that creates homelessness.
But see, then I view it this way, where if you want to prevent this violence of homelessness, right? It takes money. It takes money from other people to do it. Well, so you're going to take money from this family here. The government's going to promise that with this money, we're going to help this group here. And my response, or my view of it is, if it's not an effective allocation of money, if it's not an effective way of taking money from here, this family, A, giving it to this family, B, to help them, if you're going to do that, I would say that this is harm you're doing to this family in order to lift up this family. Now, let's say even I'm middle class and I can pay these taxes and I'm still fine. That's still some degree taking of one to another. And you can say it's fair, it's just, but I still think you're at the end of the day, you're taking the value of someone's labor unconsensually, without choice, stripping it from them and giving someone else. So for example,
you think we should ban corporations and ban businesses?
No.
But don't they take your labor?
No, but it's contractual.
Pay you?
It's contractual.
Reduced rate for it? Okay.
No, it's contractual. Gotcha. I agree to it. With the government, there's no.
So you consensual. The consensual aspect.
Yeah, it's consensual. For example.
But if I stop working, I can't survive.
Yes.
So I think that's unconsensual.
Well, yeah, but at the same time, it's like society works within, not society, life. Life works in the framework. I don't think you can point to any society where if you didn't work, okay, actually, I'm going to put the naturalistic fallacy, so I'm going to stop myself there. But I don't necessarily like that framework, because that is saying, well, because society is short where you have to work, if you don't work, then, I'm going to die. I don't think there's any society that wouldn't function that way. I mean, even I think in the progressive utopia, you still should be working, no?
I mean, I think you should be working in the sense that you should be doing some kind of labor, but I don't think it necessarily has to be profitable labor in the sense that we're, referring to it as now. And no, I don't think that people should have to do work in the sense of a 9-to-5 job in order to survive. I don't think that. I think we have achieved a society with such levels of surplus that as technology progresses, I think less and less people will have to work in order to be able to survive. As we, more and more things are able to become automated, as we have greater and greater surpluses of things like food and housing and shelter and water. I don't think that that's a society that I think we should be, aiming for. And I think this goes back to kind of what I'm talking about when I want to talk about progressivism. I think what progressivism is imagining a world in which people are better off. They don't have to deal with, a lot of the ways in which people suffer right now. I think the first step is imagining that world. And I think the second step is believing that we can achieve it. And then I think the third is trying to push our current systems to get as close as possible to that point, or at least set up the next generation so that they can carry on that vision. That's what I believe progressivism is. And, I think, to your point, should people have to work to survive? I could imagine a society in which, no, that's not the case. And I don't think we're going to get there now. I don't think we're going to get there in one generation. I don't think we're going to get there in 5 generations. But that's a society that I can kind of imagine, that I would like people to not have to deal with that, form of violence. Because I think to some extent, right, the way that work operates, I think everyone would agree who's had a job, it's oppressive. It's not a good system. The idea you need to work a 9-to-5 in order to be able to survive, make ends meet, be able to support your family. I think to some extent it is an oppressive system that, I think at some point we can imagine a world in which, your hours are less. Maybe you don't have to work as much, eventually into a world in which you wouldn't have to work in order to survive. I don't think we're there, and I don't think, I would push for a society like that now. I think labor is important in order for us to continue progressing. But, I think we need to move towards a point in which people have better lives, in which people, don't have to deal with the squalor that we have to deal with on a day-to-day basis. So I'm curious what your take is on that.
Well, I can imagine, too, this world where we don't have to work. And, I don't believe it'll ever happen. I don't even think we'll get even close to that personally. But I can believe it. I can imagine it. I should say. I can imagine it. But my view is that labor has to get done no matter what. In order to have any society churning, whether or not there'll be AI doing it or not. If AI God does come around and does do everything, we have the supercomputer. You ever see like I have no mouth and I can't scream or something? Like, if that ever happens, okay, you win. Like, maybe.
Okay, but ideally, hopefully, we would build an AI that wouldn't want to kill all of us.
Right. But
based on our films, who knows?
Yeah. Anyways,
we could get Skynet.
Maybe, but I don't see that as foreseeable. Like realistically, again, unless AI God.
And again, remember my 3 steps to being a progressive.
I get it.
Failure of the second step, but again, could be a disagreement.
Failure to the other side. I don't call it a failure. Well, maybe for you, but it's not. No failures on my end. But no, I think for every society, in order to have a functioning society that actually works, there needs to be energy put into it. Like any system, you need energy to be put into the system. And from what I can see, it's people that have to put in that energy to system. And I don't think that in some world that you're going to have some kumbaya where it's like people are going to choose to do it just, because they want to. Now, there will be people who do that, but that's not enough to create, I think, a flourishing system. The flourishing system has incentives to make people actually get involved. And
certainly.
And I think just through the ways that I just think that through the ways of how incentives work in human nature, the ones that give personal incentive, you can call it the profit motive, that personal gain, which then is beneficial to the whole society, that has proven to be the most efficient system.
And here's where I think this is probably our most fundamental disagreement. I don't think that that's human nature. I don't.
What isn't?
The profit incentive, the idea that is our greatest incentive.
No,
that our ultimate incentive is personal interest.
Yes.
I disagree with that.
No, I think the ultimate, the ultimate, I think, thing that we act upon is what's beneficial to us, or or what we think is best for us, basically. And that it could include, what's best for me and my family and stuff like that, because they're extensions of what we view ourselves, I think so. What's best for my grandpa? What's best for my mom?
Hang on, wait. Let me pause there for a second, because I entirely agree with you. I think we as humans, part of what is in our nature, per se, is the ability to expand what we think is in our interest.
Right? Well, yeah.
I think, to your point, like you just said, when we think of being selfless, right? The number one example we have in our society is our family.
Right.
Because we've set up a structure where our family is kind of almost a base unit in society almost, right? We kind of have the individual, but part of the atomization of our society includes this kind of nuclear family where this is kind of the base unit. This is kind of where we start from.
Well,
and then
I would
we
argue
start to build community from there.
Atomization is coming from the fact that I think nuclear families are starting to fall apart.
Well, I think nuclear families, when we look at it in relation, cross-culturally, from a cross-cultural perspective, is actually a form of atomization in the sense that other societies tend to be more communal, in the sense that, there is, the nuclear family, the basis is parenting, right? I think parenting in other societies we can see is communal, right? It involves a lot more people than just your nuclear family. And I think that's true of our society too, just not to the same degree.
Yeah,
I think you can kind of expand what that personal interest is. And I think that's how our society needs to move, where we expand it from being from the individual, right? Toward the family, to the community, eventually to the public good. And I think, we can expand that interest to including more people, right? And I think the way that starts is very basic things in our generation, right? I advocate for basically a social democracy, right? A push towards, certain systems that don't work for people. We can make those and orient those systems away from profit, away from that individual interest, towards the public good, towards that collective interest. And I think, we can see how different societies, depending on the way you set it up and depending on the way you set the incentive structure, you can incentivize different things.
But, okay, this, I think, harkens back to a point I had made in our second episode together, our first
throwback.
Episode. I know, real throwback. And I brought up this point of why I think that it's hard to go from the national system to an international system. But I think that the principle applies to this as well. And that is, any system needs to be balanced between its whole and its parts. In order to have a real functioning system, the parts have to work together in tandem to make the whole, but then that whole has to be sufficient in and of itself. So, for example, the United Nations. The United Nations is made up of a bunch of different parts, countries. But and these countries come together to create this whole, the United Nations. That United Nations has to be within and of itself kind of able to stand as its own thing separate from the parts, even though it is made up of the parts. It's a bit of this weird thing. But in order for a system to truly work, it can't just be, all the parts. Because if it's just all the parts with enough power, then you just don't have the whole. So it's like this degree of like balance between the whole and the parts. Society is similar, where if you have a society of 100 people, you have a society, that's the whole, but it's made up of 100 parts. But these parts come together to create society. And society in itself is a standalone thing in a sense. Yeah. But still, it's the accumulation of the parts. What you have, though, with a lot of these systems, that when we talk about increasing the whole, going from, one person to a family, to a community, to a town, to like really a country, then to maybe the international world, it's harder to maintain the parts when you have more parts in the system. For example, let's say we have a society like that's really community focused, but there's like one family that has like 50 people in it. Just like there's a huge family of like 50 people in it, and people are just more drawn towards their in-group. I'm going to be closer and feel more for my mother than I will you, but I'll feel closer to you and more for you than, some stranger out there. And you can't stop these in-group preferences. And the issue is that when you have these bigger and bigger groups, sometimes it's easy for a part to grow too large or become disproportionate and then affect the whole. And so what you have to do is create a system that keeps the parts in check. And I think because of that, you can't just have a system where it's like, we need to create more community-minded thinking, community-minded this and that, because there are interest groups. And these aren't necessarily capitalistic interest groups. There are just people who naturally come together with common concerns or common thoughts. And they can exercise things in certain ways that influence the whole in very positive or negative ways. And so you have to create the structures, and you have to understand the parts in the whole to balance that out. And I think that's where all these institutions come in that try to prevent it. And in some ways, people are able to co-opt them and create, outsized influence. But that's why I think that you can't just say, for example, we have to create a society where we expand how much people care for each other and expand the view to be a more like societal. Because fundamentally, there's so many, I think, strings attached to that. Who's deciding it? Who has the influence over the societal values? It doesn't work where the best way to do it, in my view, is that it has to be to some degree kind of broken down. And then you have these complex institutions for a reason that come together that harness personal interest rather than these weird ethereal societal interests that I think could be very, very influenced by other people. That's why I rely on the personal. That's why I rely on a bit more of an atomized view of it. Because that, I think, is harder to influence. That, to me, is harder to be influenced. Because that in and of itself, that whole is just one part, which is me.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, I think part of, my perspective is that, you just need to align the...
We've been talking for over an hour.
Oh man, Jesus. I guess to kind of wrap up this part of the conversation, I think you need to align those individual interests with the public good. I think that's the vision that we need to get towards. Okay. And I understand if you think that that's, impossible or unrealistic. And, again, to my 3 steps of being a progressive,
I gotta see that possible.
The second step is to believe that it can happen, and the third is to try and actualize it, right? So I think, that step of belief is definitely a tricky one, and I think it's harder and harder to do the more and more, I think the older we get and the more we live in, our current structures, because, those institutions start to feel realer and realer as you start to live in them more and more. Overall, I do believe in that future. I do think that, there's a way that we can get there. And I think, it has to involve, to some degree, leaving behind certain aspects of, the way we run things that do leave people behind, right? It leaves individuals behind. There are interest groups that just aren't represented in our current system that I think we do need to represent. And I think we need to do it in a better way.
Right.
That's my perspective. I appreciate yours. I appreciate hearing your perspective throughout, this entire year. Yeah. And especially this semester. We have our disagreements. I would love a follow-up conversation to be, what direction we see the country going in right now. We talked a lot more about kind of like our normative, like what we think should be the case.
It was hard because we were talking in the the ethereal, and I think
The more abstract.
It's hard for the conservative talk in the abstract because the conservative I think deals with the real world situation as is.
Yeah.
So it's a lot more grounded to like actual things that are going, which is why I think it's harder like in academia why the conservative viewpoint is kind of harder to articulate or less prevalent is because it's a lot less abstract focused.
See, what's interesting is I would say the opposite, right? I would say that the conservative tends to be more focused on, ideals that we've found through tradition and through, the society we've created. Whereas I tend to be more focused on like the actual material conditions, right? Like the number one thing that I've come back to throughout this episode is the homelessness, right? Because I think, looking at people at where they're at, right? The material conditions that people live in that they don't have to be living in is kind of where my number one passion lies and kind of what I continue to go back to. I think if we look at the current state of political affairs as regarding, what that's doing, I think it's doing, perpetuating a lot more of this preventable harm. I think, it's inflicting a lot more violence. That would be my take. I don't know how much time we have or how much time you have. I'm guessing we can't get into that.
No, unfortunately, but another time, maybe. Another time. Maybe not on this podcast because this, like I said, my last one. But yeah,
certainly.
No, I mean,
I would be actually interested in the next cohort if you wanted to come on as a guest on one of the early episodes.
I mean,
kind of doing a handing the torch.
Yeah, I think we talked about that. I think that would be really cool to do.
I think that'd be a fun one. So not your last forever, but
no, last as host.
Yeah, last as the main host.
Yeah.
How does that feel to wrap up the conversation? And the semester.
Kind of
year.
It's kind of like a weight off my chest in a sense where it's like kind of nice, but also it's like a little weird. Yeah, a little weird, I would say. So I guess with that, for the last time, at least on my end, I'm Ray Hennessy. The more I talk, the less I know. Thank you for listening. This episode was brought to you by the PolitiTeen's podcast. For more information and keep up with them, follow them at PolitiTeen's. Oh, no. I completely fucked
last
that up.
outro.
That sucked.
Not a one-take Andy.
Not a one-take Andy, no. This episode is brought to you by the Ox Institute. For more information to keep up with them, follow them at oxinstitute.org. Thank you.